When we think of the Vikings, it's almost automatic. Wild warriors storming villages, yelling through chaos, axes in hand, and conquest in their eyes. Hollywood made sure to cement that image, and it's not entirely wrong. But what if I told you that was just a small part of what Vikings actually did? Because the truth is, most of the time, these men and women weren't out at sea or fighting epic battles. Most of the time, they were at home, tending cattle, planting barley, sewing clothes, telling stories to their children. They fought, yes, but against the cold, hunger, and time. Viking life was far more complex, rich, and human than the movies let on. And today, we're going to do something rare. Set the axe aside and step into the real day-to-day life of these northern people. So take a deep breath, get comfortable, because the journey starts now. Let's find out how a typical Viking day began, right at sunrise. The day started early in Viking lands, sometimes even before the sun came up. Inside the long wooden houses, known as longhouses, the warmth from the fire still lingered from the night before, but it was already giving way to the morning chill. The first awake were often the women. Still wrapped in wool cloaks, they would light the central hearth and tend to the porridge that would feed the whole family. Outside, the silence was broken only by the sound of the wind, the lowing of animals, and the crunch of boots on frozen ground. The men, when they weren't away on expeditions, began their day feeding the pigs, cows, and chickens. They pulled water from the well. They looked to the sky, trying to read the weather. Every detail mattered. Breakfast was simple but vital. Barley porridge, dark rye bread, maybe a bit of butter, and yes, a weak, light beer that was safer than water from many streams. Meanwhile, the children were already up. There was no school, of course, but there were chores. From an early age, they learned that life in the north was tough, and work couldn't wait. It was still morning, and the Vikings were already in motion. The village came alive like a single living organism, each person with a role, a task, a rhythm. And there, in that early part of the day, you could already see the true Viking spirit, resilient, quiet, cooperative. And once the day really got going, it was time to work. A lot, with the sun high in the sky, or what could be seen of it through the gray clouds. The Viking village turned into a whirlwind of activity. Life was driven by work, but not the repetitive, boring kind of work. This was the kind of effort that ensured an entire community's survival. Out in the fields, men dug into the frozen earth with simple plows, sometimes pulled by oxen. They planted barley, rye, oats. In some areas, even flax and vegetables were grown in small plots. The Scandinavian soil wasn't generous, and the climate set strict limits. Even so, they cultivated what they could, and what they couldn't grow, they acquired through trade or expeditions. Closer to the coast, others ventured into the water. Fishing was a refined art. They used spears, nets, and lines made from dried animal gut. Cod, salmon, seals, all could become food or valuable trade goods. Meanwhile, at the heart of the village, the sound of hammers rang out. Blacksmiths shaped weapons and tools with near-ceremonial precision. Every axe, every buckle, every nail was a work of skill. Beside them, carpenters built ships, the iconic drakers, but also furniture, barns, and protective structures. Every piece of wood was used, nothing was wasted. And it wasn't just the men who worked. Viking women wove thick fabrics on hand looms, prepared wool, braided ropes, and made cloaks to guard against the cold. Some also took care of local medicine, making salves and teas from herbs gathered in the forests. The young ones learned by watching. They were apprentices in real life, shaped by repetition and example. In time, they would become masters of their own crafts. The village was a living machine where everyone had a clear role. There was a deep sense of interdependence. The warrior was only strong because the blacksmith forged his sword. The blacksmith only ate because the farmer harvested crops. And the farmer only wore wool because someone spun it. It was a circular economy, rudimentary, yet incredibly efficient. And after so much effort, the most anticipated moment of midday approached, the time to gather around the table. Around midday, the sounds of labor began to give way to a new kind of noise, the sound of togetherness. It was time to eat. In most villages, Lunch wasn't a fancy affair, but it was sacred because it wasn't just about food, it was about community. Meals were usually shared within the family, inside the longhouses. But on special days, or in the larger homes, the whole village might gather around a long communal table. The food was simple, yet nourishing. Root vegetable soups with salted meat, dark bread, aged cheese, vegetables picked in the days before. Sometimes, freshly caught fish straight from the sea. At the center of the home was the fire, both literally and symbolically. It was around that fire that stories were told, decisions were made, and food was shared. While the adults ate and talked, the children would take the chance to retell stories or invent games, some mixing mythology with their everyday world. It was a moment of pause in the day, a breath. This was also where tensions melted away. If there were conflicts, they were settled right there, with the elders acting as mediators. If there was news, it was shared between bites and laughter. Viking life was inherently communal. Isolation was rare and frowned upon. Survival depended on cooperation, and lunch was a daily reaffirmation of that. And it was in this same environment that knowledge was passed on, because in the absence of schools, wisdom traveled by word of mouth from generation to generation. If you were in a Viking village and asked where the school was, you'd probably be met with laughter. Because for the Vikings, learning wasn't something done within four walls, seated in neat rows. Learning was living. From a young age, children were thrown into the real world. Boys followed their fathers into the fields, workshops, or out to sea. Girls accompanied their mothers at the looms, in the kitchens, and in caring for the home and animals. But that didn't mean childhood lacked stories, dreams, or imagination. At night, or during breaks in the day, the village would gather to hear the elders speak. And that's where true education happened. The skalds, oral poets, held the role of preserving the people's memory. They recited ancient myths, told tales of gods and heroes, and passed down values, lessons, even strategies for life, all through verse. And every word mattered, because in a time when all knowledge was passed through speech, remembering was a sacred virtue. Children learned by listening, by repeating, by imitating, and, over time, by mastering knowledge. They learned to read the signs of nature, to predict the weather, to recognize medicinal herbs, to work with iron, wood, and animals. And, perhaps most importantly, they learned their place in the world, their role in the collective machine. There were no diplomas, but there was honor and practical wisdom, shaped by cold, by earth, and by tradition. And while knowledge was passed through spoken word, faith was expressed through action. Because in Viking life, spirituality and the everyday walked hand in hand. To the Vikings, the visible world was only part of reality. Everything around them, mountains, forests, rivers, even the sky, was filled with unseen forces. Spirituality wasn't a separate event. It was a constant presence. Before going out to hunt, men would leave small offerings to the land spirits, the land vetter. Before a harvest, it was common to bury fertility symbols in the soil, asking for the blessing of Fry, the god of abundance. Small rituals happened every day. A charm hung at the entrance of the house, a rune carved into a boat's oar, a silent gesture made before crossing a dense forest. Some families kept simple altars inside their homes, with wooden figures of Thor, Odin, or Freya. There, they offered prayers, lit flames, and poured drops of mead as a sign of respect. But the most powerful moments came with the Volvas, the wise women. They were healers, seers, and intermediaries between the world of humans and the gods. When a Volva walked through a village, people would fall silent. They knew she saw what others could not. And even on ordinary days, signs were taken seriously. The way a raven flew, a strange dream, the sudden rise of mist. Nothing was random. Everything was a message. Viking faith had no stone temples, no rigid doctrines. It lived in the earth, in the fire, in the blood of the hunt, in the silence of the woods. It was a living, breathing spirituality shaped by the seasons and by the stories. And between Viking lands, where the climate was unforgiving and survival demanded constant effort. Human bonds were treasured. Family was the heart of everything, not just as a household, but as identity itself. You were known by your father's name, by the reputation of your grandparents, by the legacy of your lineage. The honor of a man or a woman reflected directly on the name of the entire family. And within the home, relationships were more balanced than many would imagine. Viking women were not submissive, nor were they hidden. They could manage land, request a divorce, and had a strong voice in household affairs. Some even led entire communities in their husband's absence. Marriages were often arranged, but not as blind impositions. They were alliances between families, which often grew into affection over time. Childhood, too, was respected. Children had chores, yes, but also time to play, to run, to laugh, and to learn through their mistakes. They played with carved wood, animal bones, or simply with their imagination. And during moments of rest, the village transformed. There was music with lyres and rustic flutes. There were board games, feats of strength, races. During seasonal festivals like Yule or Midsummer, everyone celebrated together with dancing, feasts, drinks, and stories that lasted deep into the night. Yes, it was a hard life, but never a cold one. The Vikings understood the value of community. They knew that no sword, no matter how sharp, could protect like a united people. But even on the liveliest days, time reminded them of one truth: winter was always coming, and it was time to prepare. In Scandinavia, summer was short and winter relentless. The Vikings knew this better than anyone. So, while the weather still allowed, they raced against time, dedicating an entire season to preparing for the next. The land was harvested in haste, grain stored in leather sacks or clay pots. Meat from animals was salted, smoked, or buried in cold places. Fish was dried in the sun and hung on wooden racks to last through the freezing months. Every bit of food was a guarantee that the family would survive until the next spring. But it wasn't just about food. Houses needed repair, thatched roofs reinforced, and the cracks of long houses sealed with clay and fibers. Firewood was cut into tall stacks and covered with woolen cloths. Clothes, strengthened with thick fur and wool, were carefully sewn by hand. Women prepared dried herbs, concentrated broths, and natural remedies for illnesses that came with the cold. Men checked tools, sharpened blades, and tested traps for emergency hunting. Even the boats, the very ones that crossed the seas, were pulled ashore, cleaned, covered, and protected from the snow. There was tension in the air, but also ancient wisdom. Winter was no surprise. It was an old acquaintance. And like all old acquaintances, it demanded respect. And when the cold finally took hold of everything, it was time to make another choice: to leave or to stay. Not every day was the same, and not every Viking spent the whole year at home. There was a very specific period when the winds shifted and the seas began to open up, the sailing season. It was between spring and late summer that the Vikings set out on their expeditions. But contrary to what myths make it seem, these voyages weren't daily or impulsive. They were carefully planned, and not every man went. Those who left were usually the younger, the most experienced at sea, or those seeking glory, wealth, or trade alliances. Yes, trade, because the Vikings were not just raiders. They were skilled merchants too. They raised their sails to seek amber from the Baltic, fabrics from the East, wine and spices from mainland Europe. Often, they set out to trade and only turned to their swords when negotiations failed. But leaving meant leaving everything behind: home, children, parents. And those who stayed, usually women, elders, and children, took on all responsibilities, from tending the land to protecting the village. Those who departed carried more than shields and supplies. They carried prayers, amulets, runes carved with wishes for good luck. And every farewell was like a silent ritual, a long wave, a lingering gaze at the coastline disappearing on the horizon. But for most, the destination was different: nightfall. Home, the final stage of another Viking day. When the sun finally slipped behind the mountains and the cold began to seep through the walls of the longhouses, the Viking village found its moment of pause. It was time to rest. Families gathered around the fire, the warm, beating heart of the home. There, among the dancing flames, stories came alive. Tales of mighty gods, epic battles, and ancestors' deeds that inspired courage and wisdom. Children listened with eyes wide, soaking in the past and dreaming of the future. Dinner was the last meal of the day, simple but comforting. A hearty soup, bread, maybe a piece of cheese. Afterwards, those who could tended to last preparations, sharpening tools, sewing clothes, planning for the next day. The darkness outside felt deep, but inside the house, there was warmth, light, and a sense of safety. Even far from the grand halls of kings and warriors, Viking life was made up of these small rituals. Because in the end, true strength came from there, from care, memory, and unity. And if you expected Viking life to be all about epic battles, raids, and glory on the seas, now you know the reality was quite different. They were, above all, ordinary people, farmers, craftsmen, mothers, and fathers. They lived under the same cold sky, facing the same challenges as any community of their time. Their strength didn't come just from the steel of their swords, but from daily endurance, neighborly cooperation, and wisdom passed down through stories and rituals. The Vikings were human in all their complexity, tough and caring, fierce and gentle, adventurous and home-loving. And it's in that balance that the true greatness of their culture lies. Not in the legends we hear, but in the routine, the day-to-day, the life they built step by step over the centuries. So, next time you hear about Vikings, remember, behind the myth were people of flesh, bone, and courage. People who, just like us, did their best to live. So, did you enjoy discovering the real side of the Vikings? If you like this journey through time, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell so you don't miss any stories. And tell me in the comments, which part of Viking daily life surprised you the most? See you next time.